Okay. Welcome everybody to this week's Stages mini stakeholder workshop or partner workshop. We're joined this week by Christy Muse and Ira Yates from Friends of the Pecos River. So without further ado or delay, I will hand it over to Christy.
Okay. Well, hi everyone. I have to say, I wish I was with you in person. It's always more fun. So we'll do our best here virtually. So I'm Christy Muse. I serve as Executive Director of Friends of the Pecos River. And I want to introduce Ira Yates, who is the founder of the organization and who's had a lifetime of experience on the Pecos River. I'm much more new to the river. So I'm going to give you an overview, and Ira and I will open up for conversation. I will probably have some things to add when I wrap up. So it's nice to be here. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, here we go. So I'm curious. I wish I could see a show of hands and have more interaction with you, but I am curious if you have a vision or an experience on the Pecos River. Maybe you've seen it, but I find quite often that's not the case, unless you're a landowner out on the Pecos or just happen to be really observant as you're crossing over a highway bridge over the river. Chances are you haven't seen the Pecos River. So I wanted to show you a pretty spot on the river to kick us off. And this is just north of I-10 in West Texas in a community called Ira Ann, Texas. And that is where our work is based. And we invite you to come see us sometime out here. This is a really interesting river. And looking at a map of the kind of major rivers in Texas, you all are down on the Gulf Coast, the Gulf of Mexico, and most of these rivers in Texas flow to the Gulf Coast. The Pecos River is part of the Rio Grande River. It's a major tributary to the Rio Grande, and it flows from New Mexico down to the Rio Grande before the two rivers join up and flow to the Gulf. Um, it's about a little over 900 miles long, and about 500 of those miles are in New Mexico, and about 400 of those miles are down in Texas. And I read recently a quote that I wanted to share because these issues are so complex. But this was back in 1942 that for a river this size, the basin of the Pecos River probably presents a greater aggregation of problems associated with land and water use than any other irrigated basin in the Western United States. Well, that was said a long time ago, and my guess is that it's even more true today. Man has had quite an impact on the river, and our progressive nature has made a lot of changes on the river. And understanding these, myths and unintended consequences and natural historic events that have happened on the river really help us understand. And without that knowledge, hope for solutions for this river um, really don't exist. So we are Friends of the Pecos River, and we were established in 2020, right in the height of COVID. And we are working on what we call reviving the forgotten reach of the Pecos River. We have three main program areas: youth education, science and research, and landowner relationships and landowner engagement. And I'm going to get into that as we go forward with the presentation. But essentially, we're really trying to build the love for the river because, without a community of people who love the river, you really can't work towards solutions. And I want to take a minute to thank you for having an interest in this project, and also to thank Emily McGee for bringing this to us. We would love to work with you to create some educational tools that'll help people understand the river and inspire people to take action. So we have an idea for a project for you that's really about understanding the changes that have occurred over time with the grasslands in the watershed. But I wanted to say too that we don't feel dug in on this, and we are open to ideas that evolve and come up during this meeting. So, if there's an inspiration in the meeting today, we would like to really explore that and feel nimble as we look at the river and look at the possibilities of our collaboration. So taking a look at this interesting river, it starts in New Mexico in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. There is these are the southern end of the Rocky Mountains. And, as far back as the 1800s, this area was looked at for protection for the purpose of protecting water and stream flow. And that really was novel back then. And the Pecos Wilderness area was formally created in the 1930s um, under the Wilderness Act, actually of 1964. And this area is, I would say, protected, but actions, federal programs, things that have been done for good, such as mining for minerals, grazing leases for livestock, and fire suppression. These things have changed this precious watershed, even up here in the headwaters. Today, the headwaters is a designated scenic river, and there is a group working up here in the headwaters, the Upper Pecos Watershed Association. We see maybe a moment in time in the future where all of the groups along the Pecos River are coordinated. But as you move up out of the mountains, you start to see these irrigated lands, and irrigation for agriculture has long been a major activity on the river. For indigenous communities long ago, centuries ago, the Acequia communities used this water to irrigate for agriculture. But over time, as settlers came to the area, and agriculture practices really advanced and scaled and grew. To where an unbelievable amount of agriculture has happened in New Mexico and even in Texas. You may have heard of the Pecos cantaloupe, and it's been amazing to see how much water has been used for these practices, and even in the desert, irrigating for agriculture in the desert. But as you leave the green lands of the northern part of the watershed, you enter into more of a scrubland in an arid area, and you actually enter into the Chihuahuan Desert. And for the remainder of the Pecos River flow through southern New Mexico and all the way through Texas to the Rio Grande, the river flows through the Chihuahuan Desert. Even so, it's still heavily used for irrigation for agriculture, or has been. Also, hundreds of millions of years ago, it's important to know that this area was part of the Permian Sea. So a great saltwater ocean, complete with coral reefs and aquatic species that would not be recognizable today. And so, over time, these major geologic events have changed this area. It's a natural occurrence. But what's left under the surface are fossils and minerals that contribute to a very high salt content all along this river, which is a huge issue. And fossils, which we'll talk about, that contributed to this region supporting oil and gas to the world. The salt content in the river is a next really big issue to bring up. And I want to kind of carry this thread of both the natural and the man-made issues along the river. We talked about irrigation a little bit, but salt is naturally occurring. And down, especially around the state line, in southern New Mexico, there's an area called Malaga Bend. There's so much salt that it's actually supported commercial salt industry. And when you cross over the state line into Texas, there's a long stretch of river, a salt flat, that, believe it or not, has supported a shrimp farming industry in years ago. But the salt is a problem up and down the river, and it's reoccurring, and it's changing, and it's increasingly a problem. You know, I mentioned a little bit about irrigation, but as irrigation projects grew, and this appetite for economic growth, right, and development, and finding ways to benefit from this river, agriculture grew, and really the agriculture practices grew to where more and more water was needed and more control of the river was needed. And there was an act in 1887, long ago, that really encouraged the reclamation of the river. And the government provided cheap lands to those who would come and cultivate farmland. This was an economic development project, really encouraging people to come and grow this region and use this water for profit and to monetize the land. So with this came a series of dams that were created in New Mexico, the Santa Rosa Dam, the Sumner Dam, Avalon and Brantley. There's four major huge impoundments in New Mexico that were built for irrigation and also for flood control. There's also some like minor impoundments, like this one in Carlsbad that really just creates kind of a recreation area. But the point is, along the way, what we've done to alter the river has really changed the course, and it's really dwindled the supply. And when you dwindle that supply, you're at the same time increasing the salinity. So with this work became, competition for the water. Obviously, with about half of the water in New Mexico and half of it in Texas, there became a big question about how we share this water, and how do we calculate this water, and how do we divvy it up. So you can imagine that competition, and irrigation just continued to increase. Droughts continued to happen frequently where the river would be, really close to dry. And those were broken up by floods, major devastating floods. And even these dams that were created along the river did not tame flooding that has occurred over the decades. But it took a really long time to come up with a system for sharing the river. As far back as the 1920s, landowners and scientists were trying to come up with a calculation that would work. Politics often got in the way of actually formalizing a compact, but the New Mexico and Texas did agree to the Pecos River Compact in 1948. And this created the Pecos River Compact Commission, which would govern, if you will, or oversee how Texas and New Mexico share the river. They set a baseline in 1947, how they would make calculations to share the river, and got to work. They also agreed to work together on the issues of salinity. At this time, a reservoir was built in Texas, or very early on. It's called the Imperial Reservoir, and a network of canals were built to facilitate agriculture practices kind of in the northern part of Texas. But folks started realizing there was a desire for another major reservoir. It took a lot of negotiation, but the Red Bluff Reservoir was built after 26 years of negotiation, built in 1934 as a public works project. This major reservoir is just on the Texas side of the Texas-New Mexico border. And when it was created, it was designated to construct and own a reservoir and power plant for the use and benefit of the 7 other districts. The district would have complete possession and control and ownership of all impounded water. So imagine these dams in New Mexico and these reservoirs, and now this reservoir at the top of the northern part of the stretch in Texas. And this unique kind of private district now owns all the water that's impounded there at the state line. So they managed these irrigation districts that these canals were actually put in place before Red Bluff was built. But now Red Bluff had the control of releasing water or not and facilitating agriculture irrigation just south of Red Bluff Dam. These canals are quite old. They're dirt canals. They're operated manually. And when downstream landowners that are in these irrigation districts want to see water come for an irrigation project, they call water from the Red Bluff district. It takes a long time for the water to get there. Ira and I actually observed a moment when water was traveling through one of these irrigation districts to a landowner. And it's challenging because some of this water makes it, but not all of it does, because there's evaporation and saturation along the way. So much irrigation happens along the Pecos River from diversions from the river, but a lot of irrigation also happens from groundwater withdrawal in the basin. And actually, I read that, around Red Bluff, when it became so difficult for the farmers to get water from Red Bluff and difficult to get that water through those canals, a lot of farmers really just did turn to groundwater production once groundwater pumping became commonplace. So you have kind of these two ways we're losing water from the basin, directly from the river channel, but also from the groundwater that feeds the river. Um, you know, all of this work and kind of our design to engineer the river in hopes that we would control and see the river benefit and improve the people downstream have proved to be problematic. And every time consequences come up with these different impoundments and activities, and Red Bluff Reservoir frequently doesn't release water at all. This was a notice last year that they were not going to be releasing any water, and this year they have not released any water again. So I wanted to kind of move aside from the topic of irrigation and go back to the mention of the Permian Sea and the fossils under the land, because this is the Permian Basin. And, around the late 1920s and early 1930s and on into the 1900s really came the boom of the fossil fuel industry in West Texas and southern New Mexico, and the launch of the Permian Basin. And for the next several decades through the 1900s, this region just saw incredible transformation, everything from the economy to the culture to the landscape and the watershed. And it's very cyclical business, booming and busting. So it's great. And then there's a downturn. And gradually in time, a lot of this irrigated cropland was converted over to oil and gas production. In the late 1900s and early 2000s, things were really slowing down for the oil industry, and a lot of these old wells were kind of left behind and abandoned. And there are many issues to talk about related to that. Lots of mess to clean up, from industry over the years. But something happened in the early 2000s that really gave a new boom to the oil industry, and that was the development of the frac process and this horizontal drilling. And so there was a whole new major boom in the oil business in the early 2000s and still going on today. This is using an incredible amount of water. So when they frack, They force water and chemicals and sand beneath the earth to extract oil. And as I said, they use an incredible amount of water for this process. And when the oil is produced, um, at least 2 times, if not more, wastewater is produced along with the valuable oil. So there's this product called produced water. And this has opened a whole new issue in West Texas. What to do with this produced water? Because over the last 10, 15 years, mostly what's been happening is a salt water, a deep injection, and sometimes shallow injection of this wastewater. This wastewater has chemicals in it. It is not healthy or good to use. And so to get rid of it, they dispose it deep underground. And gradually over time, this has created a whole new another set of problems in the Permian where the area is kind of becoming pressurized and these abandoned oil wells that are left over that have been set aside and not capped have some of them become pressurized, and we've had these issues with well blowouts and seepage and leaks. This is actually something called Beamer Lake. It's a lake in West Texas that's full of water, that's just gradually growing and seemingly no end in sight because there's just not a feasible way to plug these wells. So people in the industry have been coming up with what to do with this produced water so that we're not injecting it beneath the ground. And as we see our area having more and more need for fresh water, um, could this produced water actually be a new supply? Produced water has been thought of as both a threat and an opportunity for the last several years as environmentalists and oil and gas producers and scientists and agencies have been working together to try to figure out how can we clean up this water? And if we do clean up this water, what could we possibly do with it? A first opportunity would obviously be to reuse it in the oil field. That way we would have less need to pump fresh groundwater for the frac process. But there's too much of it. There's more that we could even use in the oil field. And so what can we do with this water? And different ideas are being floated, from using it in agriculture to using it in technology, AI, data centers, um, to discharging it directly into the river. And an idea that we really love would be to use this water for some ecosystem restoration projects. How can we use this water to uh, bring the watershed, bring the land, back to a condition that's really healthy for the river? I'm just going to skim through a couple of other slides. That this one shows a sand and gravel pit that's actually discharging contaminated water directly into the river. There's all these kind of residual issues that are impacting the river, and there's really even too many to mention in the short time that we have together today. But one thing, as we've come to understand that there's a direct relationship between groundwater pumping and springs in the region. And we know this everywhere. There's a great example of a landowner along near the Pecos River at Santa Rosa Ranch with a spring-fed pond that had been used for many years as a recreation asset for this landowner and for the neighbors. And there's been a direct correlation between significant amount of groundwater pumping for fracking and a loss of this spring. And so it's an observation. The other thing to bring up about the groundwater pumping is in Texas that we really have very little way to regulate groundwater pumping. We do have groundwater conservation districts in some of the areas, but they're not everywhere. And we operate under the rule of capture. And so for the most part, people are allowed to pump groundwater with very little permitting and very little oversight. So the landscape is changing. And we are seeing more renewables, wind energy, solar energy, battery storage facilities. Things are changing. And what I really want to emphasize with you all today is this idea that the land has changed over time. All of these other issues are important for you to understand. But what I was hoping that you all might consider researching is what has actually happened to the grasses and the forbs and the landscape. Because we all know a healthy watershed is what supports a river over time. This is a picture of Horsehead Crossing, and it's one of the ways that we can understand the changes that have occurred on the landscape. Because as historians have looked at this particular historic site on the Pecos River, they've been able to document how the grasses and the trees have changed and how the river channel has changed. There are other ways that we can look at this, and I've done a little bit of research on this that I have a document that I can share with you, but a little bit of highlight. We believe that the Pecos River region back pre-settlement in the 1500s was once covered with native grasses, riparian woodlands, and desert scrub ecosystems. Near the riverbanks, there were cottonwoods and willows and mesquite. And as things change and as settlement occurred, cattle and sheep grazing began to really impact these native grasses. And overgrazing caused erosion and decline of these deep-rooted perennial grasses. Mesquite and creosote began to take over, and these riparian zones were greatly impacted. We also know that not all cattle grazing really was done in a way that impacted things this negatively. There were bison in the area that actually kept these grasses intact. And we know from some books and some stories that there were ranchers who were able to move their cattle the way the bison moved in the landscape and really follow these grasses. We know they were there. At this point in time, though, it's changing so much, and there's become more of an invasion of invasive species, such as this is salt cedar, which is one of the major invasive non-native trees that has really taken hold along the river. There's a whole story of salt cedar trees, the tamarisk trees. That's another really interesting story on the river, is how scientists and landowners and agencies have tried to tame this tree with herbicides and chemical treatments and mechanical treatments only to see it return. And there's also been kind of these myths about this tree of how much water it's used up, only to realize through further analysis that maybe it really didn't use as much water as was previously thought. So with the landscape changing, these reservoirs are dwindling. And this is back to Red Bluff. There's an incredible amount of evaporation happening in Red Bluff and far less water than there ever was. We're not receiving water from New Mexico, and the water is dwindling, which makes the concentration of salt even greater. What once was the Imperial Reservoir, a recreation area, a major water feature for irrigation, is bone dry at this point in time in West Texas. And as we look downstream, we do see the river does pick up, but even the seepage and the contributions being made to the river by groundwater are higher and higher in salt content. This is a little further downstream. One of our board members ranches who's really focused on grassland restoration. And you can really see things change when the focus on the ecosystem, the health of the ecosystem changes for the landowner. This is pushing a little further south. This is Ira Ann. heading a little further south, we get to a really interesting place called Independence Creek. This is in the lower part of the Pecos River, far south, where springs contribute, really kind of double the flow in the river and greatly reduce the salinity because we've got this unbelievable desert oasis spring system picking up the flow in the river. And here it goes through these deep gorges and canyon lands. It's a recreation area. It's an incredible historic area where tens of thousands of years indigenous people have thrived. And we cross what's known as the High Bridge, making our way down to the Rio Grande River. Really want to show this difference because this is a significant flow and a beautiful shot at the High Bridge. But this is just looking the other direction in more recent times as the river has really slowed and become full of sediment, more and more salt content as it reaches the Rio Grande River and Lake Amistad. So as you can hear, there are a lot of issues. And when Friends of the Pecos River was created in 2020, we had a lot of work to do to think about what was going to be our mission. Is restoring this river even a possibility? Is returning to a pre-settlement condition even a possibility with all of these dams and all of that has transpired over the years? And so we've really settled on this focus on reviving the Pecos River. Let's see how we can work to revive the river moving forward, but really where do we even start? And there have been efforts by agencies, government agencies, to create a watershed protection plan, to do things like manage the salt cedar, the invasive species, and do some restoration work along the river. But those have not been sustainable activities. One of the first things that we did was take a look at these past efforts. And what we learned was, as you heard in my presentation, the river is so big and the problems are so diverse and so vast that like a whole river watershed protection plan is quite challenging. And we decided to really hone our efforts on this area that we call the Forgotten Reach. We're focused on this area from Imperial to Sheffield. We're a little below the Permian oil fields, and we're above those gorgeous canyon lands that you just saw. And we feel like we have a community of landowners here who really would like to see improvements in the land and the water for hunting, for recreation. And so we've established these priority projects that we're working on, getting to know the landowners, bringing groups together, generating science, focusing on educational opportunities, providing outdoor experiences on the river. We bring high school kids out to learn about the river. We have a whole youth education program in place. We bring groups out, we bring scientists to the river. We have recreation events. We have a 4-H club. Again, we're trying to get people to paddle on the river, to understand it and love it, and bringing our partners to think about ways forward. And so we're creating educational resources, which is where you come in. And one of the things we're working on right now is an incredible 3D model of the watershed of this forgotten reach, so people can really have a bird's eye view and see all these features I've been talking about. But what would be amazing would be able to see some kind of a product that demonstrated or illustrated how the grasslands have changed over time. Some way for people to see that there were grasses, and what's happened to them and what is in existence today. I've started doing a little bit of research, and there is a lot online. There are data sets available to look at, but this is something that's not just being studied for the Pecos. This is a research that's going on worldwide. In North America, it's estimated we've lost 62% of our grasslands. And look at this chart. Texas is certainly, no exception. So I've started collecting data sets. There are kind of like two types of data available. There's the more recent data sets from the 70s into the future that are more like satellite data that is available. And then there's the pre-satellite data that's a lot more about putting together the stories, assembling the images, looking at documents, and researching kind of stories that have been passed down. There's two incredible books that would be available to you if you were to pick up this project. Bitter Waters is really the Bible and where most of our information comes from. The story that I've tried to tell you in a short amount of time is the story that's told in this book. And then The Half of Texas, which tells the story of a farmer who really read these grasses and knew these grasslands and maybe can help you understand what was. So it is a river of hopes and dreams. My contact information is here. I am going to stop sharing and try to answer questions, and maybe we can have a little conversation about visualizing what this product would be. I thought it would be something that could be used by students to get their eyes on the evolution of grassland in this region, but used by adults too, because a lot of people never think of it. And, could also be used in this whole conversation we're having about what to do with produced water. We're realizing that the oil and gas industry doesn't really understand these issues I've been talking to you about today. And so if, wouldn't it be neat if they got excited about restoring these grasslands and if we could work together on using produced water to that end? So that's a lot. I'm going to pause and open to questions. And maybe before I do that, I'll give Ira an option to add, or maybe we'll just go right to questions. What do you think, Ira?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you very much for a very comprehensive presentation, which I'm sure everybody can appreciate, and I certainly do each time I hear you speak to it. My main participation at this moment would be to pick up on one of the books that you mentioned, the Half Merchant Rancher, Half of Texas book by Patrick Darren. And speaking of the rangeland and the way it changed, the very short story is this fella ran cattle in this exact same area from Sheffield south all the way north to pretty much to Imperial, back over to Midland of all places, and back down to Ozona. That is a very huge region. It's just the east side of the Pecos River. Now, the short story is he started when the cattle first came in, the buffalo were extinguished, and cattle were brought in. They were herded up the river, and they only had the river water to drink. So any impact of the cattle, whether it was too many cattle or cattle at all, they grazed down the land and the grasses that we're interested in right along the river. And then as the story progresses, they learned to put windmills in. That was a time that windmills began to be active, and they were able to move 20, 30 miles up the canyons and be able to spread the cattle out, and they ate those grasses, and those areas became overgrazed and changed significantly. So it's the book about Half is just the time period is the time period that we're most interested in, because as the buffalo ranged, as Christy said, and chased the water and the grass as the environmental changed, and then they'd come back after fences and people started putting these improvements in that I just mentioned, fences and others. The cattle could not move, And therefore, that's when the overgrazing occurred, and that's where you're going to see the change in data in your data points on the grasses. So that's all I really wanted to point out, was that the Half story really is about this region and literally the loss of the vegetation over that period. Thanks, Christy.
All right, questions?
Hello? Oh, good, it's on. Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. This was really interesting. And I think as somebody who's currently doing a graduate degree, anthropogenic impacts is a huge conversation topic. And I think obviously things have changed a lot over the last decades, but even over the last couple hundred years. My biggest question for you both is kind of what time scale you're looking for in this project. Are we talking about 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, just so that we can look into the data a little bit more and see what's available? I'm more concerned about historic data availability than more recent, because there's a lot of things for remote sensing, like you said, with the satellites. But I'm just curious kind of what your time frame is looking like.
Yeah, I personally would love to see us go as far back as we can, as far back as feasible. So that's my best answer. I mean, I would love this project to just look back as far as the data could take you.
So my opinion about that is two thinkings processes here. One is pretty much before, as long as the native animals were there and white men had not affected the grazing operations of the watershed, it was probably what we would call natural as you could be, and the changes. And so that would have been, I would take maybe 1850s, 1870s for sure, forward to today in that range. Now, and by the way, there'd be a lot of publicity. I mean, the old newspapers, San Angelo newspaper, Livestock Weekly, these all have stories. I have read stories from 1907 about somebody saying, we're overgrazing the land, we need to be careful. And of course, nothing changed. But that's the kind of data or information that's out there. It's not a data set, but it's a source of information for your story. And then the other thing is, most recently, because of our association with the Produced Water Association, this fellow Eric Bernard was speaking to me about native grasses and all, and they are somehow going back in time, looking at the archaeological layers in the soil and actually identifying vegetation that was more like what Christy was saying, hundreds of years ago. And I don't know anything about that project. It's just, you heard just now the only thing I know. But if somebody's doing that kind of research, it would be fascinating to find out what it is and put some of that into your process if it's available.
That is a really good point, Ira. And I have a handout on kind of some research topics and some people and resources is what I'm trying to say. And Eric is one of those people, but there would definitely be, in addition to some leads on where to go to find some information out, we would have a list of resource people you'd be welcome to reach out to.
Thank you guys. We really appreciate you guys talking to us and bringing your questions. My main question is, do you have a current 3D model situation? I just need some clarification there, or is that what you guys are looking for?
We're making a 3D model, and the 3D model is not designed to be a tool to teach about the grasses. The 3D model is like a bird's eye view of the forgotten reach of the Pecos. It shows the topography, the tributaries, some of the major features where the USGS stream gauges are, where some historic areas are. So it's an orientation 3D model, like large scale, that we can take into a classroom or a meeting, get around this this big model and have a conversation, hopefully inspire curiosity. I don't know, in terms of the deliverable from your project, I could see it be a series of maps, a presentation, maybe a map set that we look at, a progression. That would be one idea. But I would be really open on like how the deliverable happens. Maybe you would have creative ideas that come up. So it would be a supplement, not, it wouldn't be part of the model. It'd be something different that could be used with it or independently.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that clarification. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet.
Can you hear me? Hello? Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Christy and Ira. It's so good to see you guys. And I really enjoyed your presentation.
You were there. Hello.
Yes, I'm right here. I don't know if you can see my hand.
Hi. Yes, I can. I see you now.
I really enjoyed the history of the Pecos River, especially since I grew up there. But one question I had was for the project, would it be possible to like you were talking about the invasive species of the cedar. I know in GIS you can use the different colors of the landscape to identify like different vegetation species. Have you heard of anyone identifying the cedar species specifically when using GIS to map I don't know, West Texas landscapes?
Well, it's been done, but as far as I know, there's not a recent. Ira, do you want to, you're nodding, do you want to jump in? I don't think there's a recent map. In fact, we're looking for one and we would really love to have one because this beetle project that's getting ready to launch, like having that map would be incredible. Were you gonna add, Ira? Before I jumped
Well,
in?
I know back in the, 20 years ago when the Beetle project was initiated and considered, there certainly were aerial analysis of the river and the foliage in the watershed. So, and then more recently, of course, we worked with Sean about that, identifying different vegetation types along the river, trying to identify or distinguish between the salt cedar and other things. But in terms of a real data set, I'm sure they're out there, but I don't have a personal knowledge of each one of them.
Yeah.
Thank you guys.
The data sets I'm aware of are pretty high on the salt, like getting that granular on identifying salt cedar. They're high level and they need like an analytical, someone to really sit down and drill in and get a little deeper into it and also do some field work to truth out the maps in order to get really specific on a species like specifically salt cedar. Ground
Jason, I see
truthing.
your hand is raised.
Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. So, hey, Christy and Ira,
Jason.
good afternoon.
Wow, good to see you.
Good to see you as well. I haven't seen either one of you in maybe 15 years.
No, I'm so thrilled you're here. Here's your person, everyone. This is the guy.
Oh, I appreciate that. That's so sweet of you. I don't have a question. I wanted to just say hello to you all.
Oh,
Thank you for the presentation. When you see what you've laid out, it can't be overstated how complex and how many moving parts and how daunting trying to tackle an issue like this is. So I just wanted to say thank you for your perseverance. Thank you for raising this issue here. I've been working with the Stages group and Audrey and Dorina and the team and the staff here. I hope you find that you've got top-notch people and they're going to bring some really interesting perspectives to bear for you if y'all are working on a project together.
thank you, Jason. Where are you located these days?
Henley, Texas. Been living out here for about the last 14 years.
Oh, we're not that far. It's great to see you. Thank you for the kind words. It's very hard to wrap your arms around, as you said.
Yes, ma'am. Good to see y'all.
I love that you're affiliated with this. That's great news.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been at the land office for about the last 14 years now, and I've been working mostly on coastal water quality. So it's exciting to see some West Texas. That area is so near and dear to my heart, and it's infatuating to go out there and to get buried in its mystique.
Yeah, well, we will welcome anyone on the call. We'll show you around if you would like to come out and experience it. You have to take a field trip out there to take on the project.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jason actually seeing TGLO up there just reminded me also, when you're doing any sort of mapping project and you're looking for historical maps or historical data, the land office has an insane map library. And their archive, you just reach out, let them know what you're looking for, and they can help you navigate it and arrange for you to come in and see what you need to see, get scans of what you need.
I don't know if anybody knows how to answer this question, but for the historical data, if we wanted to go back to the early 1900s to look at grasslands, how would we be able to analyze the areas of grassland versus whatever, since the color scheme is only black and white?
Mhm. Well, I think that's where the stories come in. And like Ira mentioned, some of the publications, maybe there is some research available at the Haley Library. You know, Patrick Deeren has written about it, but I think that's where the anecdotal research, talking to people really is the way. And that's one reason why this is so important, because to my knowledge, no one's really assembled those stories before. I know that's maybe a different kind of data than what you're typically working with, but you know, people like Ira carry around this information, but there's not a real easy way to educate other people about the changes that have taken place. So yeah, I think it would just be a matter of good old-fashioned research.
It's fascinating where you pick up tidbits of information describing the way things were. There's a particular survey thing going on locally here in the river park in Ira Inn, trying to locate a particular survey point that has great historic value and history just because of the way it was identified, being on the river with ripples and two islands. That's very unusual in any surveying anywhere in the world. And so there's a new interest in finding this marker, which we think has been covered up. But my point being, as I read these reports, and they're going back to 1873 and more particular 1937, they describe the vegetation briefly and what the river looks like. So it's it's just interesting where you might pick up some information about the way things were. It doesn't have anything to do with surveying. They were just describing the landscape. So the resources are varied, but it's going to be print probably, but from that period. So I just wanted to give a little insight there.
Any other questions? Okay, any questions online? I don't see anything in the chat.
Well, thanks for monitoring that.
Okay. Yep, doesn't look like there's any questions in the chat or online. Thank you, Christy and Ira, for your presentation today and coming to talk or joining us to talk to us. Our trainees will be assessing all of the project presentations and drafting executive summaries that we will share with all of you in the next few weeks. And then our big workshop is in May, I think on the 20th, Tuesday. So you'll be receiving an RSVP and invites for that, and we really hope you're able to join us. But thank you. Also, shout out to Emily, who made this connection and made this presentation possible today.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you all for listening. Is that a question or a wave with Philippe?
I think it's applause.
Oh, it's applause. All right. Y'all have a great day. Thank you.
You too.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you.
you, everybody.
So.
Bye.